Welcome to ANN In Depth. Today we'll be talking about COVID, the pandemic, in terms of God's judgment upon us. We have been seeing many memes about God and COVID and what this means, and we're going to try and explore that in terms of trauma and what we can learn from it. Always trauma is bad, but some people that go through it, survivors of some different traumas, discover that they've learned new skills and new tools. And in order to have a conversation about this, we have invited a very special guest. Dr. D. Knight is here with us. Dr. Knight, thank you for joining us for this conversation. First, tell us about yourself. You're a clinical psychologist in Alabama, and you have a doctorate on neuropsychology. Tell us more.
Yes, absolutely. So I use my doctorate in neuropsychology to minister to trauma survivors mostly. I also do assessments for some of my time. So just to kind of clarify whether or not people have anxiety or depression, ADHD, autism, all sorts of different diagnostic clarification. But I also use my doctorate to help people who are experiencing trauma or who have experienced trauma. Specifically, childhood sexual abuse is one of the areas that I deal with a lot.
At the beginning of the pandemic, we were wondering if you have people that experience abuse in their homes, if as we're all in lockdown, that's exactly the worst place for them to be. Have you seen any evidence that this is a problem or not? Are you busier since the lockdown? Tell me more about that.
Yeah, so I'm probably about as busy as I was before the lockdown. However, there's kind of a problem with that because we know that numbers on domestic violence have risen because more people are stuck in a home that maybe is not a safe environment, and more people are stuck with less options for leaving or exiting the situations that they were in. But we also know that reports are down for child abuse, and that's probably because schools are closed. That's probably because there aren't people recognizing that, hey, there's something going on in that home over there because we're so much more isolated than we were previously. So it's kind of a bad thing that reports are down, but we know that that the violence and the rates of abuse are actually up.
Let's talk about the biblical concept of God in the Old Testament, especially. Um, it seems that he used trauma sometimes to call people back to what they should be doing. So let me explore a little bit of this thought, and then you tell me what you think. You have this covenant of God and his people where God says, I'm going to make a covenant with you. I'm going to teach you how to live lives of freedom. So I'm going to teach you about hygiene. I'm going to teach you about freedom. I'm going to teach you the Sabbath. There's a commandment of freedom, that your value doesn't come from how much you produce, but you can stop one day a week to remember where your value comes from. You have don't lie, don't steal, don't commit adultery. All of these things that are very important for someone who wants to live a life of freedom. And there are, hundreds of laws, not just the 10 Commandments, where God establishes, this is how you're going to live in the desert. This is how you're going to live when you get to the promised land, and so on. And God says, if you follow these laws, all will go well with you. Mm-hmm. Your land will prosper. It will be wonderful. But if you don't follow these, then you will not eat from the land that you planted. And then, God says, Leviticus and Deuteronomy, similar passages, if you still don't come back to me, then the next series of disciplines and punishments are worse than the first part. And it goes through a few of those steps. And God even says in other parts of the Bible, I discipline those who I love. Mm-hmm. Do you find people perceive, or some people perceive, that this pandemic is God's judgment upon an earth that lost track of how to live?
Yes, I do think that people tend to perceive it that way because oftentimes people tend to perceive God as punishing. I think the Barna group did some research on that, and most people, it was, I think, like 70%, continue to see God as a punishing God, one who deals out punishment when we do wrong things, not necessarily a protective God, not necessarily that, oh, well, maybe those things have consequences, because it's going, if you don't have those consequences, you will not be protected from worse outcomes or from worse things that you might do. So most people, I think, tend to see God as punishing or punitive in some way. And so, yes, I think people view the pandemic that way more than often or more often than not. But it doesn't necessarily mean that that's the absolute truth. So sometimes we come to some realizations and some beliefs, and it's not necessarily the objective truth about God. And I think that God, even when we look in the Old Testament, God has always been a God who works within our cultural framework. You look in the New Testament, and he's still that same God who works in our cultural framework. It doesn't mean that that's the only way that God can work. It doesn't mean that it's the objective truth about God, that he's a shaming God. But the Old Testament culture is a very shame-based culture. And so I think oftentimes, as the writers would write things, it was often for the people that they were writing it for. And it doesn't mean that it's not relevant to us today. It's still relevant to us today. We just have to distinguish between what are God's absolute truths and what are the characteristics of God versus what are the ways that we tend to view ourselves, like through shame and through punishment and through rules and regulations, versus is that just God just working within our cultural framework and loving us in that way?
We have and this is an in depth, so feel free to go in depth about any of these subjects. We're not on television. This is YouTube. We have plenty of time. We have trauma, people that have gone through trauma, and I'm sure there is some technicalities between what it consists of trauma as opposed to just a really difficult time in your life. And there are some that go through difficult times that perhaps would classify as a trauma or traumatic experience even. And they find that this reshaped them and gave them new tools and a positive outlook on life. Is that part of the process? Or what is trauma and how do we deal with it?
Yeah, is being transformed by your experiences, like, is that a part of the process? I want it to be. I always want it to be. I was reading actually an article online about a gentleman who had a car accident that was very traumatizing for him, and I thought it was brilliant something that he said. He said, I found that not only did I have post-traumatic stress, so not only did I have post-traumatic stress disorder, but I also had post-traumatic growth. And I said, oh, I love that. I want that for everyone to come out of a situation and say, I grew in some way. Not everyone experiences that. And there's various reasons why. Our genetics are different. Our experiences are different. Our thoughts are different. One thing that we know about like depression and anxiety is that no matter where it comes from, it could arise because of a trauma. It can be because of our genetics. It could be our neurobiology, just our chemicals are off. No matter where it comes from, it is maintained by our thought patterns. There is some thinking that keeps us depressed. There's some thinking that keeps us anxious. And so that's why we like to combine not just medication, but we also like to combine it with some psychotherapeutic support. That's therapy sessions, right? Counseling sessions. Go to see a counselor because there are so many different outcomes you can have from a similar event. Everyone can experience 911, right? 9/11. Everyone can experience the pandemic. Everyone can experience a genocide, right? That's going on, and come out with different experiences from it. So how do we know who's going to have the good outcomes? How do we know who's going to benefit or prosper or somehow be transformed by their experiences? Well, again, our thinking patterns. It's how you view the experience that you've had. It's much more than just the experience. It's how you view that experience, how you process it, the community that you have around you to support you. All of those things matter.
So whether God, is just stepping back and allowing our misconceptions of how we handle nature. He was very clear on how we should relate to wild animals. And this virus came from a wild animal that we became too intimate with, in terms of the wet markets and the whole food process in China, especially. This is the third virus that comes from animals that just, for lack of a better technical term, they jump to humans. They find a way of infecting humans. And God was clear. Don't live like this. We decided to break it, and now we have this pandemic. So on the one hand, it's a very natural process. On the other hand, could God have stopped it? Probably, but he didn't. For whatever reason, we have an all-powerful God that either allows or brings different things to bear in the lives of many. Biblically, suffering isn't an option. In fact, one of the promises of Jesus is that you will have
tribulation.
It's a promise. You can count on that. You will have it. So we're always surprised when it comes, obviously, because it takes its toll on us. But what are the sorts of things that you imagine some people that have been hit really hard with this pandemic and all the changes that they could be thinking of at this point to emerge better and stronger at the end of it?
Yeah. So a part of what you said is something that we focus on sometimes, that in this world you will have tribulation. But the second part of that is equally important. It says, be of good cheer, for I've overcome the world. Right. So it matters what hope we have. It matters whether or not we hold on to being of good cheer, because that matters. And it's a choice. It really is a choice. It becomes a choice, a moment by moment, day by day choice. And we don't always like to hear that, because we don't always like to know that, oh, I'm responsible to some degree of what my outcomes are. Yes, we absolutely are. The word of God tells us to take every thought captive. It would not tell us that if we were not able to do that, right? And so we are able to take every thought captive to the obedience of Christ. We are able to choose joy in a situation. I love this picture of it's a black and white picture, and it looks like maybe it's from some other country that's war torn or something. And there's a lady sitting on top of a heap of rubble, drinking from a nice little teacup, and it says, "Peace is a choice." And so that's not to diminish or to minimize anyone's suffering. It's simply to remind us that we have a choice on what we do with our feelings. We have a choice on where we focus our thoughts. We have a choice on how we, end up with whatever outcomes we end up with. And it's day by day, it's moment by moment, and it's not going to happen by accident. One of the things I often remind people is that you have to be intentional. That is the word of the day. Be intentional. If you're not intentional, you will not accidentally wake up and have a good day every day for the rest of your life. You will not accidentally wake up and have victory. I tell people all the time, victory does not happen by accident. You have to work for it. You have to actually fight for this thing. Remember when God talked to the children of Israel, he said, everywhere that you put the sole of your feet, that's where you can claim, right? So you have to actually walk this thing out. You can't just sit back and expect, oh, it's going to wash over me. No,
I
you
never
will have
thought
to
of
work
that.
for it.
I never thought of that. Your feet need to be there, so you need to
Yes,
walk, and
absolutely.
it's a desert too.
Yeah.
That's very interesting. Are there any techniques that one can use to have that intentionality,
Yes.
to be aware that they're not a victim of the circumstances they find themselves in?
Yes, absolutely. So I don't mind people, people talk about a victim mentality. And I think that that's a buzzword that people might use when they talk about, shifting and making changes. I don't mind people acknowledging that they've been victimized. I think it's a very important part of our healing, is acknowledging your story for what it is. So whenever people talk about, whether they talk about being victims versus being survivors, I let them label themselves for whatever season they're in and however they feel about it at this time. I think you can be both. You can have been victimized, which means you were a victim, and also a survivor, which means you survived this experience, right? So there's nothing wrong necessarily with thinking of yourself as a victim, as long as there's some forward motion to it. I love what this pastor, Stephen Furtick, said. He said, don't let anything leave your mouth that you cannot follow up with, and that's just the way I want it to be. Now, here, I'm going to explain that. Doesn't mean that you have to lie to yourself, right? So you don't have to wake up and you feel kind of bad and you're like, okay, I feel good because that's just the way I want it to be. And I'm just going to say this until I believe it. No, you don't have to lie to yourself about how you actually feel, right? But do not co-sign that you feel bad. And this is what I mean. So if you wake up and you feel bad, tell yourself, instead of saying, man, I just feel terrible today, wake up and say, I really want to feel better than I feel right now. That's still true. It's still acknowledging that you're not where you want to be, but you're shifting your thoughts just a little bit, not a whole bunch. You're not lying to yourself and saying, I feel great, but you're saying, you know what? I want to feel better than I feel right now. And is that just the way that you want it to be? Absolutely. Do you want to wake up and feel bad for the rest of the day? The things you repeat, the things you rehearse, you will get better at, including negative thoughts. The things you continue to allow to take place and take root in your mind, you will definitely get better at. And so that's why I say just make a little shift, right, in the way that you think through things. You wake up and you're like, things are going terrible already today. Is that just the way you want it to be? don't speak those things. Speak about, okay, things have got to turn around because this is not where I want it to stay. And that's just the way you want it to be, right? So that's just a tiny shift in your thinking. That's a tiny little strategy that you can use. Breathing exercises, progressive muscle relaxation. There's lots of guided imagery. There are lots of ways to kind of bring the stress level down. And so when I say bring the stress level down, we all have this thing called allostatic load. And so it's how much you have stress building up in your life. Funerals can be a stress. So can weddings. Having a baby born. It's a good thing, but it's still stressful, right? And so if you have a lot of stressors in your life, it's kind of like you're just building and building and building, and you have this stress just building up. And eventually you're going to pop your top. You're going to be more irritable. You're going to have just less and less space to have peace in your life. What I suggest is that you start figuring out, what are the things that are causing this stress in my life? What are the things that are causing me to feel overwhelmed? What are the things that I can take off of my plate? Because rest is so important. One of my favorite authors, Dan Allender, says the number one indicator of longevity in ministry is rest. If you are not resting, you are not prepared to do the work that God is calling you to do. You have to rest. And so lots of different strategies that you can kind of pick up and think through, like, how do I reduce the stress and, start saying no to people more often, which I think is a difficult thing for people quite often. But I tell people all the time, you know how I learned to say no to people? I practiced it in front of the mirror until I liked the way my face looked when I said it. So I practiced all sorts of different, no, nope, not going to be able to do it. No, sorry, can't. And it feels crazy making, but I promise you, what's really crazy making is saying yes to everyone. And then feeling like you don't have enough sleep, and you're snippy with your husband, and you're rude to your children, and you're mean to your boss, right? That's crazy making. And then wondering, how do you get out of that cycle? Start saying no more often. Practice it all that you can so that you can say yes to the things God's calling you to.
You are speaking to me. I needed to
Yay.
hear this. Learn to say no. It would be tremendous if I ever mastered that.
Yes.
Cognitive behavioral therapy. What are your thoughts?
Well, it's a type of therapy. It's an approach to therapy. Not all therapists use that, but I am definitely a believer in that approach. I am very eclectic in my method for treating clients, patients. I just go with whatever is going to be best for the person in front of me. Cognitive behavioral therapy has probably some of the most research behind it because it's a very manualized. We know that, okay, we're going to focus on these thoughts. We're going to think about the things that are affecting your emotions, because our thoughts, and that's the kind of the idea behind CBT, is that our thoughts will influence our emotions, will influence our behaviors, right? So just think, if you run into somebody at the grocery store and you're like, hey, how are you doing? You're all excited, and they're like, hi, I'm fine, and they walk off, right? You might be thinking to yourself, like, what is their problem? Like, did I do something to them? Like, how did I cause some problem with them, right? You're thinking, those are your thoughts. Now, if your thoughts are, they've always been jealous of me, that person has always been jealous, they hate that I've got the job instead of them, you're going to have negative behaviors and emotions about this person. If instead you think to yourself, they must be going through something right now, I wonder why they're acting like that, you will have totally different thoughts and totally different emotions. You will walk away with a totally different experience. Cognitive behavior therapy is about, let's examine those thoughts. And there's actually a place in the New Testament where Jesus actually asked I think it's the Pharisees, when they're asking him all of these different questions, trying to catch him up. And he's like, why are you thinking these thoughts? Jesus is actually telling us, think about your thoughts. Like, why are you even thinking these thoughts, right? And so we can engage as humans in something that's called metacognition. So cognition is just thoughts. It's just your thinking. So when we say cognitive behavioral, we're talking about our thoughts and our behaviors. So metacognition is thinking about thinking. We have a wonderful ability to do that, something that monkeys don't have, right? Monkeys aren't sitting around thinking, like, I wonder what I should do later. I should maybe do some exercise, or maybe I should have eaten that banana, or I shouldn't even be thinking this way, so I don't eat these bananas. No. We get to think about our thinking, though. And that's how you take every thought captive. You cannot let your thoughts, once again, just run roughshod over your life. I don't know if you've seen what is that Disney movie? Inside Out.
Mhm.
So on
Yeah.
Inside Out, they actually have this thing called the train of thought. And
Mhm.
that really is kind of how it is. You wake up in the morning and your thoughts are just ready to go. And you have to train your thoughts where you want them to go. So that's why when people talk about, I do my devotional at night because that's just a better time for me, I'm like, mm-mm. You can say that if you want to, but how you set the intentions of your day matters. Where you set the intentions of your heart matters. And so you have to wake up and decide where your thoughts are going to go. You have to lay down the railroad tracks for the train of thought. Don't just let it go and go roughshod over you. My husband and I, we went to, I think it was DFW that has the trains that run through the airport, and it's like a city in there. And so we got there and we got up to the train platform and we were so happy. We just got there right when the train was about to close the doors, and we hopped on, and it went the opposite direction of where we wanted to go. And we didn't think about it. And usually we do, but we didn't have very much time. So we just got up and we hopped on the first train. And a lot of people get up and they just hop on the first train of thought. Train of thought is, I don't feel good today. And they just hop on that train and it just tells them where their life is going to go for the day. Instead of making a decision, and again, here's that word, intentionally deciding where your thoughts are going to go. Waking up and saying, I choose to have a good day today. Waking up and saying, I choose to be a forgiving person. Waking up and saying, God, it's difficult and I'm feeling the effects of it, but I choose to forgive the person who's caused me this trauma, right? Choosing where your thoughts are going to go, so that you tell the railroad, you tell the train where the railroad tracks are. You tell the train of thought where they're going to go and where they're going to settle for the day. That's cognitive behavioral therapy at its best.
The reason why we don't like change is because of loss. Because every change we're going to lose something, and it's the fear of loss. And this pandemic and lockdown and the impact that it has on us, many of us are losing things that we thought we had and we took for granted, and then suddenly we lost and we're losing and we don't know when it's going to come back. And part of that process is the loss of hope, because what do you do if you had plans for a holiday, or that you wanted to do this particular thing with friends or family, and now you don't even know when to plan for? Okay, we'll do it next year, but will you? um when is the world coming back to normal, whatever that means? So it's not just a something that you lost and you can deal with. It's that you are now still tumbling in the car, in the crash, not knowing how you're going to land, and with every turn there's a new bruising that takes
Mm.
place in many different ways. And usually we're not all going through this together. I think that's a unique thing about this, is usually, we all go through crisis. It's inevitable. Suffering is inevitable. And we all handle that differently. But now we have this very disruptive experience that at least a city or county or state is going through together, if not a country in the world. Um, how can we look at this loss? And even as we are continuing to lose, how can we have healthy thoughts and control our thoughts, uh, even as we go through this now?
Yes, so you're right. We are all experiencing this collective trauma, is what I call it. We are all in this experience where it's like we don't know, and as humans, we love predictability. We like to know that I will turn on my computer and it will work, right? We like to. There was you said we don't like change. There was some change that they made in Microsoft Word like 10 years ago. I still don't like it. They moved the edit button. I'm like, why would I not want to edit things? I still complain about it 10 years later. So absolutely, I'm going to experience a loss, like not being able to have the job that I usually have, not being able to perform that job in the way that I usually perform it. People, like, we suffer loss all the time. Getting older, and now my knees hurt going up the stairs. It's just like we're constantly losing different things, and so that is a life experience that we always had. It's the pandemic really is not a different loss. It's different in a way because we're kind of isolated. But remember, we're always losing things as we get older on planet Earth, because that is just the nature of us aging and going through things. I think it can be important to focus on some of the things that we gain as well, and that we don't have to put our lives on pause waiting for the pandemic to be over. There are so many different ways to actualize the purpose that God has placed in you, that you do not have to wait until this season is over or whatever season is over. And I actually encourage people that, regard whether it's pandemic or not, Do not wait to fulfill whatever your purpose is. Every single day that you wake up, remember that there is a purpose for why you woke up that day. Even if it's that you're honing your skills for something that God is going to use you for later, but start to work on those things that God has called you to. Do not wait until a pandemic is over. Do not wait until a situation, any bad situation that you're in, is over to begin to live life fully with the purpose for which God has called you. Your purpose today might to be nice to the people in your home. Your purpose today might be to go on a walk and smile at the people that you see when you pass by. Your purpose can, I love what one pastor said. He said, sometimes purpose looks like obedience. Be obedient in the place that you are right now. That is purpose. That's what Gideon did. Gideon was obedient in the small things like threshing wheat, right? We have so many biblical examples. Ruth, she was obedient in the small things, gathering wheat for Naomi, being faithful to her. And God will use where you are to fulfill your purpose.
Tell me more about purpose, because this is a really complicated thing. We all want to know what the purpose of our life is, whether you are an atheist or a Christian or any other major belief system. We all want to understand our purpose, which is odd, because if someone who's listening is an atheist, it's very difficult to even find the idea of purpose, because 10 million years from now, nothing that you do matters. Everybody you know is going to die. So what's the point of it all? To continue to allow a new generation to come? How does that? It's very easy to go into nihilism. But if you happen to believe in God and you take the Bible seriously, then purpose is something that you don't have a choice for. It seems that God has given every human being purpose. And specifically, what is my purpose today, as you mentioned, or for this week or month or year or life? And it may look like obedience, so just do your best according to what you know today, and the rest will reveal itself. The plan will reveal itself as you go forward. But tell us more about your thoughts on the idea of finding your purpose and dealing with that, struggling with that.
Yes, and so I want to even clarify what I said, which is that yes, we talk about purpose sometimes looking like obedience, and that doesn't mean that you don't have other plans. It doesn't mean that you don't have some type of goal that you're working towards. But when I say that, I'm simply saying for the people who are so stressed out that they haven't figured out their purpose and they don't know what God is calling them to, there are some things that God calls all of us to. If you're talking about Christians, you're talking about we are all under the Great Commission. From the moment that you said yes to Jesus Christ, you were under the Great Commission. Go ye therefore. You have a purpose, right? The word of God, I think it says in Jude that we ought to be snatching souls from the fire, right? And so we all have a purpose. We all have an overarching glorify God, tell the gospel and make disciples, right? We all have that in common in our lives, but it's the minutia, it's the small day-to-day decisions that make up who we are. It's like when you look back over your life, it's usually not just big decisions, it's a lot of little decisions that got you to where you are. And so that's what I mean when I say sometimes purpose in the moment looks like obedience. It looks like just doing the thing that you know is the right thing to do, and not doing it is a sin. Not doing the thing that God has called you to, not being obedient, not smiling when you know you should have smiled at that person, not being kind and showing kindness when you know you needed to show kindness to that one individual, right? And so sometimes that's what I mean when I say purpose looks like obedience. You have made an impact, and oftentimes we look at outcomes, and I've got to tell you, we have to divorce ourselves from outcomes. That is none of our business. What is our business is to be obedient, not to look at the outcome. So sometimes, and when I said not to look at the outcome, I guess I'll use the example of Gideon again. Gideon had no idea that the writer of Hebrews would put him in the Hall of Faith. He had no idea that he would, right? I mean, none of these people knew Abraham. In fact, the Bible tells us not only did they not know, it says that they all looked at the promises and perceived them from a distance. That means they never laid claim to all of the promises that God gave them in their lifetime. But now we can look and see, yeah, God did make Abraham a father of many nations. He really did fulfill those promises. So here we are on the other side of history for them, and we're able to see God has been faithful. We're able to see that obedience in the moment really does amount to something, even if it doesn't seem that way in your lifetime. That, right? We don't know what's going to be written about our lives later, but we are each living epistles, and are we living out the thing that God has called us to in the moment. So that's what I mean. And that doesn't mean don't set goals. When you set goals, one of the main things I always remind people is please have a time limit on your goal. Otherwise, it's a wish. So we say goals without time limits are wishes. And you can look up this thing called SMART goals. You want your goals to be specific and measurable, attainable. So not unrealistic goals, right? You want them to be something that you can actually attain, and you want them to have time limits for sure, because that way you can measure and you can see, well, am I any closer to becoming the attorney that I know that God has called me to be? Am I any closer to applying for med school? Am I any closer to doing the mission trip that I know God has called me to go on? Right? So you want to be able to measure the goals so that you're going towards your purpose. Yes. But in the meantime, in that time where it feels like I haven't moved any closer to the goal, in the time that it feels like I haven't done anything that seems to be of purpose, know that your obedience in every moment is going to be used by God.
And there's also a concept of God's timing and our timing, isn't it? You
Yeah,
you set your
absolutely.
most efficient timing, and then God sometimes comes and says, "No, I think this is a 10-year project, not a
Mhm.
6-month project. So you don't have all the skills you need. You don't know that yet, but I do. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna pause this project. I'm gonna send you on this journey, sometimes painful, so that you can acquire the skills that you need, and then we're going to come back to the project because by then you'll be ready to take it to the next level." That's certainly been the experience of my life again and again and again. And it's hard to be patient because you set all of these visions and you can see the thing happening and ready and so on. And then all the doors that were open suddenly they all shut. And now you have to handle the shut doors and you go, okay, what do I do? And that's the part that of the outcome, I think, that you mentioned. The outcome isn't your problem.
Mhm.
You do your best, you set your goals, you focus on the results that you believe are right, but ultimately God will decide and God will navigate and work through so that, well, so that you can have a an outcome that is for his glory, not your own. And that part is sometimes really tricky. How do you think our ego plays a part in this whole process? I read a book called Ego is the Enemy, and I loved it. What are your thoughts between ego and the idea of purpose and loss and all of this?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think I love that you brought up the idea of timing. It is so important because it's often not that we are concerned that God is going to be good to us. We're concerned about how long it's going to take him. We're concerned about how long will it be before I see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living, right?
Yes,
And so
yes.
it's not just that we don't trust God, it's that we don't trust his timing. And it can be difficult as human beings. I always tell people, cut yourself some slack. The word of God says that my thoughts, this is God talking to his people. He said, my thoughts and my ways are not your thoughts and your ways. They're higher than the heavens are above the earth, right? Or my thoughts than your thoughts and my ways than your ways. He's saying that that's how different my thoughts are and your ways are. The furthest observable object in the universe is 13 billion light years away. That's how different God is saying my thoughts are than his thoughts, right? And so it's okay to not know God's timing. It's okay to kind of get things wrong along the way. It's okay to be concerned that, hey, I might not be measuring up to what it is God is actually calling me to. And how do I know in that meantime, right? So beginning to trust God's timing becomes very important. And one of the things I think about with God's timing, we have two different thoughts about time. And when we look in the Bible, we see that we talk about time in two different ways, the Greek words chronos and kairos. And so chronos, if you think about chronological, right, that's Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock. That's the chronological time. We are based on chronological time, chronos, but God is based in kairos. And kairos is that at just the right time part. So we often use the example of when a woman is supposed to be due to have a baby, she's due on August 1st, and that's when the due date is, and we're expecting the baby. That's chronological. But kairos is this morning is July 20th, and she woke up and has contractions. That's just the right time. That's Kairos time. That's what God works on. He looks at the beginning of time and he looks all the way down in history and he is able to see what is just the right time to do what it is he does, right? And so I love one of the best things that he did at just the right time. It says, at just the right time, Christ died for the ungodly. Thank you, Lord. So we don't have to worry about God's timing. He obviously does things at just the right time, but it's so hard to shift from Chronos. It's so hard to shift over into that God. And I'm telling you, and this might sound kind of cliche. It might sound like, oh, come on, that's not going to help. The only way that we can get on God's timing is if we spend time with God. The only way that we will really get in tune with his and in alignment with what it is he is doing is if we spend time in his word. We spend time in our prayer closets, the things that we don't want to do. Okay, we want to sit down and watch the reality shows. We want to sit down and do the work and we've got to get another job so that we can pay all of these bills and sitting down and praying about it. Is it going to help me? Yes, it is. It will help you get your mind in attunement with the mind of Christ. It will help you get your mind in alignment with the heart of God, which is a heart towards suffering, which is a heart towards being near to the brokenhearted. These are the things that are ultimately important. And so if we can get on God's timeline, so often we can relieve ourselves of the stresses that we feel in this world.
When I was in the seminary, my bachelor's in theology, I remembered I was 17 when I started. And by 18, they asked me to teach English. I was in Brazil studying theology there. And by 19, I was teaching 32 hours a week between English at university level and the special language school they had at that university. I think they still do. And plus the 25 hours I had for my own degree. And between preparing classes, correcting papers, and doing all the work of the teaching and my own work of studying, I had no time. And I came across this phrase, the story from Luther. And Luther would say, I have so much stuff to do today. I have so many things to do today that if I don't spend 3 hours with God, I will never be able to accomplish it.
Yeah.
And I started putting that into practice. I never got to the 3 hours. I started with 5 minutes and then I went to 10. And you're wondering, you're a theology student. 10 minutes, is that enough? No, it wasn't. But that's all I had. And that's where I started. And the 10 turned to 20, then turned to 30. And the more time I spent with God, the more things happened properly.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a great lesson to learn, that when it's very easy for you to fill yourself with busyness that doesn't lead to any proper outcome. So it was a great lesson to learn. And it still has an impact today in terms of understanding God's timing versus ours. And in this crisis that we're living through, the concept of time is also important because we don't know when it will end. We don't know whether we'll have a vaccine next year or whether it will be approved or not. Some countries have already started talking about this year having a vaccine. But by the time we can trust it and our CDC or other government agencies can trust it and make it available to the public, this might not be in the next few months. It might take a much longer concept of time. And just as we're talking about this, I want to welcome another guest for our program today. Catalina is speaking to us from Australia. Catalina, welcome. How are you?
Hello and good morning.
Hi. Thank you for joining us. It's rather early there at the moment for you, but we're very thankful that you could join us here. Tell us a little bit about the Connected Adventist podcast.
So the Connected Adventist podcast, I roughly started it. It's almost going on 2 years. It will be 2 years in November, I think, the first week of November. And basically, I just felt extremely and strongly impressed that digital ministry was the way to go. And yeah, I decided, hey, let me get into this boat and ride it with others. And yeah, I decided to start that podcast. And it basically is just my personal journey through different aspects of what it has been for me to be an Adventist. But in addition to that, it actually turned out to be a real personal experience of me going through a stage in my life that was quite difficult, getting to the point where I nearly lost my faith and turned my back on God, and then deciding that I wanted to continue to walk with Him. So it was almost like renewing my vows with God during the podcast. So it's pretty personal experience.
Catalina, we're talking about suffering. We're talking about the pandemic. We're talking about God's timing and how it's difficult to find a moment where you can say, okay, life will come back to normal after this moment here. How have you dealt with this, with the loss that inevitably has come through the pandemic, the gains sometimes, and this patience that we needed to develop in order for us to get there?
I think there's some really practical things that we can do. As I've looked at, and basically as I've discussed with just different people, I actually asked a question on my Facebook, on my personal account, of just people, hey, what have been the lessons that you've learned? What are the things that you felt you've lost? And what are the things that are your fears? And consistently throughout many of their responses, one of the biggest things that people felt that was a loss was connectivity, to be able to have that social interaction, solidarity, to be in a community, to be with your family. So I think as we try and look at that, let's be very realistic about the things that we feel we have lost, and maybe the things that we actually realistically have lost. And what are some ways that we can try and gain control over those situations and over those specific things that we feel or are experiencing that we have lost? And I guess once we identify those things that are really deep on our heart as feeling as something that has created loss, fear, anxiety, uncertainty, how can we help to counterbalance those? What are some practical things that we can do? We have services like this. We have online platforms. We have so many ways of still remaining connected. And then the physical aspect, well, we just have to have that hope that we will have it. It will be restored, maybe restored in a different way. But there's always hope that we will be able to find some kind of new normality in amongst everything that we have experienced.
Dr. D, let me come to you with this idea of touch, which is incredibly human, incredibly important for our health. And for those that live with their families like I do, 3 boys, my wife, then we haven't really felt the lack of it, because we're always, hugging, and the boys are always fighting with each other, which is one form of touch. But how do people who live alone and have perhaps not had it for months, will this have an impact on their health?
I think it absolutely impacts our health. There aren't a lot of options other than being willing to quarantine along with those individuals. They do say that that's actually a low risk activity if 2 families are both quarantining at the same time. Excuse me, but that's one option. I'm so sorry.
That's all right. Let me ask you the same question, Catalina. What do you think the impact will be?
Look, I think it's been really, really rough. I'm in similar circumstances as yourself. I'm with my family, so there is probably not as much of a separation from social interaction and physical interaction as what other people may find. And I guess, like Dr. Knight was saying, that it is crucial for human existence to have that interaction and to also have that physical interaction as well. And I guess, we're just going to have to really work through that. And God says that He will provide for us on so many levels. And I believe that once we're able to just work through God with that, I joke around with people and I tell people that my love language is physical touch, and that's my top 3. It's 1, 2, and 3 is physical touch. So I'm an extremely affectionate person, and I am the type of person that, when I meet someone new, I feel the need to just place my hand on their shoulder or on their arm. So I'm very much wired up that way. And I have found it very difficult engaging in conversations with people, even now that some of our churches are able to go back. So we've gone back to church, and there's this awkward, like, oh, I can't hug you, I can't shake your hand. But it's just a matter of retraining your mind to go into certain situations and understanding that, okay, this may just be for a period, and there's just other ways that God can help us to strengthen us through those areas that we feel, a real pull to and a real need to have in our life.
A lot of people are considering the meaning of this crisis. And as we were talking about earlier, there is an idea of God punishing, because a lot of people have experienced parents who, and it's so easy as parents to do this. I find it incredibly easy, and it's the temptation is sometimes difficult to resist. So if you do this, God will be angry with you. And God seems to be this angry God that is constantly looking for any opportunity to bring upon judgment. And some people believe that God is constantly angry. And that goes exactly against the biblical evidence that God has done everything he can to save. And the moments where judgment does come, like Sodom and Gomorrah, like the flood, and this final judgment, it's related to the suffering of the innocent. That there was something that was incredibly wrong, and through God's actions, that there was some form of freedom thereafter, or at least the stopping the carnage. So as we look today, it is no wonder that people have attributed this to an angry God. And there are some memes that were, I thought it was incredibly funny. What was the meme? The Jonah meme. If whoever was supposed to go to Nineveh, just go. And this year is particularly difficult because it isn't just a pandemic. It's one thing after the next that is happening. So Catalina, let me come to you and give you more opportunities to share with us your thoughts about how do we present a better image of God to a world that is not sure whether he is very interested in our well-being or not.
Look, when we really look at biblical examples throughout the Bible, we have examples of different ways that humanity experienced suffering. Some of the suffering was brought on themselves. They chose to rebel. They chose to be involved in what we would call sinful behavior, which as a result had a detrimental effect on their mental well-being and on their physical well-being. So there are some things that we can very clearly say, hey, this is actually not from God. This is basically a result of personal choices, of things that we have placed ourselves in. And then there are things that are so supernatural that, example, fires, hurricanes, all those natural disasters that we can't really put a finger on it and say, was this, a punishment, a divine punishment from God, or was this really just the result of living on a sinful world? And I think for us to try and place ourselves in that position to really say with complete confidence, this is why this has happened, is a very dangerous place for us to be. And a very dangerous place, and specifically in respect to how we are portraying God's character and even the aspect of God's judgment. I think it's very dangerous ground to sort of walk on. My first way of sort of presenting situations like this is I really try and break it down as much as I can. This is how I usually, and specifically with coronavirus, I've been very specific at telling people, from what we understand, this was created as a result of people eating certain types of animals. Even if we don't believe that theory, if you're going on the other way that, that this has been done by as a conspiracy theory and, it's trying to do things against us and, China's doing so, whatever your theory is, specifically in this situation, we can trace it back to humans. We can trace it back to humans making choices to do certain things. It's not something that God specifically was like, hey, today, whenever it all started, it started in December 2019, I'm just going to throw a pandemic out on the world. There were specific choices that were made. So I always try and bring people back to, hey, can we trace this back to a reliable source or somewhere where it has begun, rather than let's just assume everything is God's punishment or that everything is sent from God. We can, with certain things, trace it back. And I believe that with coronavirus, we can definitely trace it back to something that is probably not going to be directly associated to God's judgment or God's punishment on humanity.
Dr. D, what are your last thoughts for us in this whole conversation, please?
Yeah, I love what Catalina has added to this. Absolutely. I think that anytime we try to figure out just exactly what it is God is trying to teach me in this moment, that already is a little bit of a problem, because the reality is it's not about us. We try to make things about us. We try to personalize so that we can get some understanding of what it is that's going on. But once again, we will not understand everything about a God who says his thoughts and ways are light years different from ours. And so just recognizing that, listen, we do have an overarching purpose. We still have overarching, goals and things that God wants us to do with our lives. It does not mean that we have to stop those things and that we have to get rid of our ideas of what purpose was prior to the pandemic. And, Catalina talked about finding some normalcy in what we're experiencing. One of the things I love that a colleague said, she said, I'm sitting here in my sunroom and I'm seeing clients virtually, and I'm tempted to believe that I'm working from home. This is not true. I am surviving a pandemic. I am surviving something. And so if we can shift our focus to the idea that we are surviving something, we need to have compassion for ourselves. We need to have compassion for others. The only way we are going to get through this is with a whole lot of grace. That is for ourselves and that is for others. That means we have to do some shifting. It means we have to accept that, hey, some people might be a little more irritable than they were. We might be a little more irritable than we were. We need to find some ways to mitigate some of those symptoms, but we are surviving something. It is not that we are, stuck in this place forever. It is not that we have to create a new normal that only applies to this situation. No, we're trying to find some normalcy, but we are surviving a pandemic. So give each other a lot of grace.
Thank you. Catalina, any other last thoughts about all of these subjects?
Yeah, basically just continuing on what Dr. Knight said, I think we have to be okay and we have to be able to accept the fact that we are living in something that most of us, I can guarantee, have never lived through. And as a result, that has created changes in so many aspects of our lives, from our personal life, from our family life, our work life. Relationships are so different. We're actually experiencing an abundance of change, and change always comes about most often with a lot of discomfort. It comes back with a lot of pushback. And so we have to be able to process, hey, why are we pushing back on this? Why am I struggling to accept the reality of the fact that I can't leave my home, the fact that I have to go and do groceries once a week and I have to line up for 3 hours? Why is there pushback? And how can we process that? And how can we get to a point where we can be like, okay, this is what it's going to be like for a little while, but also remembering the very fact that this isn't normal. This isn't how it's supposed to be. And this isn't how it has been. So as a result of this new change and this shift, hey, how can we learn to work with it until things become a little bit more like what they used to be, until we can have that interaction, that community, and I guess just go back to what it was before COVID-19. But at the same time, acknowledging the fact that, what are we working through and how can we best build resilience during this adversity that we are having? What are some practical ways that we can do that?
Catalina, Dr. Knight, thank you so much for joining us for ANN In Depth. You've been watching ANN In Depth, and we hope that you have subscribed to the channel, you have clicked the little bell, and add your comments to the thoughts. Obviously, we are talking, the three of us here, but we need to hear what you think and how you have experienced this crisis, this change in everything that has been happening. So just write down your thoughts so that we can read it and engage with you. Until next week, I hope that you can manage to feel better, perhaps in your own reality. And we'd like to pray for you, if you don't mind. Dr. Knight, can I ask you to pray for those that are at home having to experience some of the things that we talked about today?
Yes, absolutely. Heavenly Father, thank you so much for another opportunity for us to just spend time together discussing some of these things that we're all experiencing. God, I ask that for the individuals who have listened to this program, whether they caught a snippet or the whole thing, that you will bring healing into their lives, that you will bring clarity of thought into their lives, that you will remind them that they do have a purpose in you, that you have given them purpose, that you are giving them life and opportunities for a reason, and that you will fulfill those things in their lives, that you are a God who keeps your promises, and that you are a God who listens to their prayers, that their tears don't somehow get lost in their pillowcase at night, that you are listening, that you are attentive, and that you care about what it is they are going through. It's in the name of Jesus I pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next week.